Happy Monday, everybody. Hope you're all having a good week. And we're at the first week of the Aetherdrift. And every Monday I do my best of one, best of three meta review based off of Untapped for best of one, and then the standard challenge for best of three. And I have to say that the new cards from Aetherdrift have not made it into the tracker data in large amounts. They are kind of sparing, which I think is good though too, because a part of the reason why I do this is for people who are new to Magic the Gathering, and it's fun to explore the new cards, but if you have a limited amount of wild cards, you definitely want to make sure that they aren't bad crafts. And with that in mind, it's usually best to hang on to your wild cards, hang on to your crafts for the first week or two, if you're really looking for what is going to turn out to be the best strategy. Now, so let's get started. And again, this is from Untapped, which is a third-party tracking software. This is a way I can kind of remove my bias, but I've been playing Magic the Gathering since Portal in '97, so hopefully I can add some insights since this is something that I do for hours each day. So first up, we have Mono Red Aggro at number 1, according to Untapped, for Bronze to Mythic in Tier 1. And we can see that if we compare this to the last list I covered at the end of Foundations, this one has ditched the 4 copies of the Hired Claw, and as well as the 3 copies of Shock, to bring in the 3 copies of Witchstalker's Frenzy, as well as 4 copies of Might of the Meek. And so if you remove the 4 copies of Might of the Meek and put in the 4 copies of Hired Claw, this is the exact copy of the Worlds list that was in the top 8 back in October. So there has not been a whole lot to making this deck in its perfect form. Personally, I think a lot of the last little tweaks come down to preference. I like the Hired Claws, and I've been running Shock instead of the 4 copies of the Might of the Meek. Some variation like that, and has been pretty decent. Obviously, it's going to change the matchups to be running that much single point interaction, but that's kind of what I hope to get to you guys with these conversations each week is the pros and cons. They're all good and bad for their own reasons, right? So Witchstalker Frenzy, you can do the 5 damage to yourself or to your opponent by shooting the Screaming Nemesis, and is a way to kind of make this into a 1 deal 5 to your opponent, which can definitely help up the speed of the clock. And then you also have the Might of the Meek, which helps more with making your Emberheart Challenger a little bit better off of the prowess. And then the mice synergies. So it's another way of giving yourself trample. The Monstrous Rage as well does it for the double strike off of Manifold Mouse. The other thing that I like to do, in case you are returning to Magic the Gathering, is talk about the matchups in the meta, and also go over the opening hand. What cards have been working the best in the opening hand. So Mono Red is favored against Golgari Midrange, Gruul Aggro, Domain, and Azorius Oculus. Anything that can struggle a little bit against the early pressure. It beats Gruul Aggro because it's basically the same strategy without the inconsistencies of 2 colors in the mana base. And then it is weak against Mono Black Midrange, Boros Auras, and Rakdos Aggro. And we've talked about this a lot throughout the weeks, but in case you're returning to Magic for Aetherdrift, Mono Black Midrange has a lot of single point interaction, which disrupts the mouse trifecta of Heartfire Hero, Emberheart Challenger, Manifold Mouse. And the Boros Auras has the Sheltered by Ghosts, which if it gets down the ward, which is why I like to run multiple versions of the Shock and Burst Lightning, makes you slightly better if you can protect yourself against the Sheltered by Ghosts. But the lifelink, it can be really problematic for this deck. And then Rakdos Aggro is a pure aggro strategy, not running any disruption for your opponent's stuff. So wins the game a turn sooner through the fling. So the best cards for your opening hand, you're looking for Heartfire Hero and Manifold Mouse, and Hired Claw, which this list is not running. You definitely want to be starting on turn 1, and the Heartfire Hero into the Manifold Mouse is just ridiculous, especially on the play. In number 2, at tier 1, which means it's just in the same standard deviation, is statistically comparable to everything else in tier 1, is Boros Mice. And this one is an archetype that we've seen around in some form, usually in best of 3, and there's been a renewed interest into it. I'm not exactly sure why. Maybe some large content creator was reminding everybody about Boros Mice. So, because it was explored when we got the cards Mabel and the Flowerfoot Swordmaster in Bloomborough. But anyway, compared to the list that we talked about in Best of 3, this one is dropping 1 Hired Claw and running 2 additional copies of the Flowerfoot Swordmaster, which gives the deck more of a mice feel, and then is also bringing in 2 copies of Inti, Cynical of the Sun, which is an interesting one, usually seen in more of the Delirium, but you do get to put a +1/+1 counter on target attacking creature, so it is a way to trigger your Valiant as well. To make room for it, though, we're dropping the 3 copies of the Lightning Helix, as well as 1 copy of the Shard Mage's Rescue, to bring in an additional copy of the Sheltered by Ghosts. Again, this is a card that's really going to help you against mono red. And then the lands are largely the same. We ditched a Rockish Carnival, which is kind of the budget land, and brought in 1 Soulstone Sanctuary, which we're seeing more in mono red and in Boros Mice, since it can also have the mice synergies, getting double strike for the Manifold Mouse, for example. So Boros Mice is a little bit new to Best of 1, so I don't have a lot of matchup experience with it, nor is there a lot on the tracker. I do know that the cards in your opening hand that tend to be the top performers are Manifold Mouse, excuse me, and the Mabel. But this also has access to the Heartfire Hero into Sheltered by Ghosts, which works really well for Boros Auras. But what distinguishes this archetype from Boros Auras is the Manifold Mouse and the Mabel. So as time goes on, I'll get a better idea of what exactly the best opening hand is. Number 3 is Boros Auras, also in Tier 1. This version this week is running the 3 copies of the Monastery Swiftspear, dropping 1 Feather of Flight, and dropping the 3 Atali's Favor that sometimes we see at the top end of this deck to run an additional copy of Demonic Ruckus, and then dropping 1 Plains for the Thran Portal. Largely, I just think personal preference on that one about whether or not you want to be running more bodies, or if you want to be running more enchantments on the top end. So applying more pressure means you're going to punish the decks that you have a faster clock against. Atali's Favor then helps you if you are kind of needing to extend against the single point interaction of like mono black. So this archetype is favored against mono red aggro, especially if you can get the Sheltered by Ghosts to stick. It is weak against mono black mid-range because it's very good at preventing the Sheltered by Ghosts from sticking, and then also has Nowhere to Run, which gets through the ward. And so this deck is also weak against Esper Self-Bounce for the same reason, especially if they're able to bounce the Nowhere to Run over and over. And this one, the opening hand, you're looking for Heartfire Hero, and the Sheltered by Ghosts really are your top performing cards in the archetype. And number 4 here, also in Tier 1, is Azorius Omniscience, and this is one that we've been talking about throughout the weeks in my series, The Meta Breaker, that I do on Sunday. So the Best of 1 Meta Breakers, if you want some more stuff that's actually involving the Aetherdrift cards, I highly recommend that, as well as the Best Decks by MTG Joe, I think was particularly good this week, bringing in a lot of like mono blue with the River Churn Monument and everything, and big fan. So Azorius Omniscience has been around for a while. This is the first time that the tracker actually incorporated it into the top 8. And if we compare it to the lists that we had seen in the Best of 3 tournament scene, we can see that this version is not running the Picklock Prankster. One of the things that's a little bit awkward about the Picklock Prankster is that it can only hit instances and sorceries, so it's good for finding your Abuelo's Awakening, but it's really bad for finding your Invasion of Arcavios. This one is also dropping 1 Moment of Truth, and bringing out 2 Chart a Course. So a lot of the ways that we were enabling the self-mill to get the Omniscience into the graveyard has been kind of pulled in this version. However, we are bringing in the Founding of the Third Path, which is another way to kind of mill, and then can play the Abuelo's Awakening from the cards that have been milled. So keep that in mind. You may want Chapter 4 to land so that you have 4 mana when it resolves. So if you play this out, milling 4 cards instead of playing an instant, you're going to want to have done that when you already had the 4 mana, because you don't get to play a land when it goes to Chapter 3, right? So you're going to want to start this on turn 3, not turn 2 if you do Chapter 1. So just something to keep in mind if you are running the Founding of the Third Path. Try to time it so that you have the 4 lands for the Abuelo's Awakening. The other thing too is we're bringing in 2 copies of the Soul Partition, which can kind of help prevent this deck from just losing before it gets its combo off. And then we also have Jace, and so being able to bounce the Jace with the Soul Partition, you can mill yourself to enable the combo. You can also mill your opponent, since some versions will be running like the Breach the Multiverse, which this one is, so you can win through mill several different ways. And then bringing in 2 Refute. And this, I like this because when you play your combo of Abuelo's Awakening, one of the ways this combo breaks down is they shoot the 1/1, right? And so if you usually have to try to have a Confounding Riddle or a Refute in your hand, so this gives you some more stuff to be able to protect your 1/1 from the instant speed removal so that you can then slam an Omniscience down and they don't disrupt the combo. So I really like that, especially because you then draw a card and discard a card, so it also works if you need to get one of your key pieces into the graveyard. The land's got a bit of a tweak, so we're running 1 less Meticulous Archive, running the 3 less a Darker Wastes, and running 2 less a Blast Zone, which is a way of kind of dealing with the go wide strategies. Dropping 1 island to bring in the Plains, the Flood Farm Verge, the Seachrome Coasts, and the Fabled Passage, and the Conduit Pylons. I like the Fabled Passage, so this one is just running 2 more, and I think leaning into a full play set makes a lot of sense because it kind of thins your deck of the lands, so you're being able to more efficiently dig for your combo. And then we might as well cover the combo. The combo is you get Omniscience into your graveyard. On turn 4, you do a Abuelo's Awakening for X = 0, bringing you a 1/1 copy of Omniscience from your graveyard into play, allowing you to play Invasion of Arcavios. Now, there's 2 loops. One is to use This Town Ain't Big Enough and bounce 2 copies of Invasion of Arcavios to then loop playing Beseech the Mirror and then This Town Ain't Big Enough. There's another one in Best of 3 which uses the Heroic Reinforcements and Unnerving Grasp to attack them with a whole bunch of an infinite amount technically of haste creatures. So in this one you're going to want to first play the Invasion of Arcavios, get Beseech the Mirror, use Beseech the Mirror without the bargain to grab another copy of Invasion of Arcavios, play Invasion of Arcavios to get This Town Ain't Big Enough, play This Town Ain't Big Enough to bounce both Invasion of Arcavios, get 1 to get Breach the Multiverse, play Breach the Multiverse, use the other one to grab This Town Ain't Big Enough from your graveyard, and then just loop that over and over, right? Easy. And then Peerless Recycling is in there in case you're if you have Beseech the Mirror, you can grab Invasion of Arcavios if it's in your deck. If you've milled all 4 or all 3 into your graveyard, you then use Peerless Recycling to grab your Invasion of Arcavios instead of Beseech the Mirror. Otherwise the loop is the same. So this strategy is weak against mono red aggro, being one of the mini decks that kind of struggles against the early pressure, the turn 4 win in mono red. And then, but if you're not running the right disruption, it can be very punishing to strategies like mono black. So the cards that I look for the most in my opening hand are Afara's Dispersal and Philology Archaeologist. This is largely because these are your best cards against mono red to help improve your your toughest matchup on the best of 1 ladder, which they also enable your self-mill while also kind of slowing down your opponent's strategy. So I look for those 2 quite heavily in my opening hand. Number 5 is Rakdos Aggro, and now we're into tier 2. So these are slightly worse, but anything in tier 2 can be taken to Mythic as well. It just requires a little bit more grinding, a little bit more luck. So this one, we do finally see some changes. Foundation, this was in Foundations, this was a relatively stable strategy. And in this one, we can see that they brought in a little bit of more mice synergies, which we've seen throughout the weeks. So bringing in 2 more copies of the Emberheart Challenger, and then bringing in 1 Manifold Mouse. Some of the Rakdos Aggro strategies ditch this entirely and just lean off of the Slickshot Show-Off combo, or the Heartfire Hero combo, or the Cacophony Scamp. So this is leaning a little bit more into creature-based threats instead of combat tricks, which are a little bit more susceptible to being blown out by mono black. It's dropping the Urabrask's Forge, which helps out against the mono black matchups, and then also dropping the 4 copies of the Dreadmaw's Ire, running the 4 copies of the Mirren Bane Splitter instead. Both have their pros and cons. Dreadmaw's Ire gives you trample. The Bane Splitter hangs around for future turns if your creature doesn't die. If you put it on like a Heartfire Hero or a Cacophony Scamp, for example. We're also running 1 copy of the Might of the Meek because we've added in a little bit more of the mice synergies, which then helps lean further into the prowess strategy specifically. And then we're also seeing a decrease in lands. Some of you were saying that 20 lands was way too high for that for this archetype, and I agree. I've seen a lot of 18 to 20. It ranges. This one's dropping 3 mountains to run a single copy of the Blazemire Verge, and giving you at least a little bit of the opportunity to actually play Callous Sellsword instead of just running it as a fling. Some people have mentioned that there is one of the pros to running just reds or just mountains is that you don't give away that you are the Rakdos strategy. But if you I think a lot of people will know as soon as you play something like Turn Inside Out or Cacophony Scamp what they're up against. So I don't think you lose too much by bringing in the black lands. And personally, I like to run more just because it does open up alternative lines where you can use the Callous Sellsword as a big body and you're not always just flinging it to face. Sometimes you need to fling it and destroy your opponent's creature. So this one is favored against mono red aggro because it's not running disruptive elements. It is a turn faster and is more of a pure aggro strategy, not having the non-linear disruptive elements like shock, lightning strike, etc. It's weak against mono black midrange and Esper Self-Bounce, still struggling against the single point interaction or removal. And then the opening hand is Heartfire Hero and the Turn Inside Out. Turn Inside Out on top of the Monstrous Rage gives you a lot of power if you are especially flinging it at your opponent and then getting a 2/2 out of it. You do not need to have it do a one-turn combo for it to be the right thing to do the Turn Inside Out and then fling it. So it's an interesting deck. Sometimes it can be a little bit trickier to pilot than it appears. You can also just jam like turn 3 wins with Slickshot Show Off. So some people don't really like this strategy in the meta. Also showing up in the top 8, which I think we actually saw in week 10 of Foundations, is Gruul Delirium. So this one's in tier 2 as well, and we see a couple of changes. So this one's not running the Rubber Belt Maverick, which is the single green drop that helps kind of enable the Surveil. And then this one's also not running Inti, which whenever you attack, being able to discard can be a really good Delirium enabler in my opinion. But it is running 2 additional copies of the Keen-Eyed Curator, and this helps out against the Azorius Oculus as well as the Azorius Omniscience deck, being able to remove their graveyard. A lot of times when you're playing that Azorius Omniscience deck, you kind of just scoop if they play the Keen-Eyed Curator, because it does, as long as they keep the mana up, completely destroys your strategy. The Pop Hatch Recruit is up to 4 as well to kind of punish the removal. And then this one's dropping the 2 copies of the Monstrous Rage, which is a way to get kind of a faster way to do it is to do Monstrous Rage into Violent Urge. And this one's also dropping the Huntsman's Redemption, which was a 1-of enchantment, which helped kind of up the land types, or sorry, the different types for Delirium. This one's deciding to run Wrenn and Realmbreaker, though, which gives you the 7 creature types. And then I think at least, let's see, there's Artifact, an enchantment off of the Fear of Missing Out. So this one's running a 3rd copy of the Violent Urge, so leaning more into the Double Strike than into the Monstrous Rage into the Double Strike, which can get 3 for 1. And then running an additional Torch the Tower, which is helpful for exiling sticky threats, problematic blockers. Gruul Delirium was another one that's more common in best of 3, so I don't have a lot to say about the matchup data for best of 1. If this becomes a ever more popular archetype in best of 1, we should get a little bit better idea of the good matchups. The opening hand is also relatively... I haven't played the deck a lot, and the data on it is relatively low, but you're looking for early interaction like Torch the Tower, because this does tend to be a little bit slower than the mono-red strategy. And then you're looking for your early threats, like Wildfire Wickerfolk is really good at getting your Delirium when it dies. You get to the artifact and the creature. And then Patchwork Beastie for that same reason, but also for enabling Delirium by milling a card at the beginning of your upkeep. So you can get really crazy surprise wins out of this deck. It's a lot of fun to play with the Fly Trap, and yeah, just beating in with a huge Wickerfolk that gets to attack twice because of the Delirium off of Fear of Missing Out, and then you give it Double Strike, and it doesn't lose Double Strike the second time that it attacks. So if you can attack with the Double Striking 5 power, you hit them for 20 damage, right? That's kind of what you're trying to achieve with this deck. Number 7 is Mardu Aggro, and this one is largely the same thing as Boros Auras, but it has the Callous Sellsword for a fling. We're dropping 2 Monastery Swift Spears to play 2 additional copies of Feather of Flight. Again, we see this kind of go back and forth depending on slight variations in the meta, but whether or not you want more bodies or more card draw. And then we're also dropping the Rockish Carnival and the Plains and the Mountain to bring in the 4 copies of the Battlefield Forge, which is just, if you don't have the Battlefield Forge and you want to stick to more budget options, look at the Rockish Carnival. Otherwise, I think it's worth running the Battlefield Forge. This archetype is like Boros Auras, is favored against mono red aggro, but it is weak to Esper Self-Bounce and the mono black mid-range strategies, still struggling against the single point interaction or removal. The best cards are just like Boros Auras, though. You're looking for the Heartfire Hero and the Sheltered by Ghosts, and I guess it's still a little bit of a coin flip against the Boros Auras itself, but it's slightly favored because of being able to fling lets you win a turn sooner in the mirror match. So that's kind of the appeal of the Callous Sellsword. And you're like, finally, are we going to get to some cards from Aetherdrift? Well, let me tell you, we finally got there. So number 8 is Azorius Oculus in best of 1. Number 8 in best of 1 at tier 2 is Azorius Oculus. And this one's dropping the 2 copies of Kiora, as well as a recommission and 4 unsummon to bring in the Soul Partition, which is an old card, but Spell Pierce, which we got. So it was in Neon Dynasty, which is why it's showing the Neon Dynasty one here, but we also got it again in Aetherdrift. So that was something that rotated out briefly and is now back in the meta in Standard. And then this one's particularly nice for people who are trying to disrupt your Helping Hand or your recommission with counterspells. And then we also have Bounce Off, which I think is largely going to replace the unsummons and the one that can bounce permanents but gifting them a fish that I'm blanking on for 1 blue, because it allows you to bounce your opponent's stuff or your own. So that's kind of the upside to Bounce Off. And I guess additionally it can also target vehicles. So we're also bringing in 2 copies of the Temporary Lockdown. This one's a pretty popular choice in best of 1. You don't usually see it in best of 3, depending on if you're planning on coming up against a lot of Gruul prowess. It'll be sideboarded in best of 3. Because best of 1 is a little bit more aggro oriented, Temporary Lockdown typically works pretty well in the tech spot. And then this list is not running the Get Losts, which I might have already mentioned, but I'm a big fan of the Get Lost personally. I'm a little sad to see, like, Soul Partition and Get Lost. It's kind of like choose which one you like. But the lands, we also see the non-budget version. So if you are on a budget and you don't want to craft all of these lands, listen to the ones that have been subbed out from last week. So 1 Abandoned Campground, 1 Temple of Enlightenment, 3 Lonely Oreos, and 4 Tranquil Coves, as well as 3 islands to run the Meticulous Archive, 2 additional copies, the Flood Farm Verge, and 1 copy of the Undercity Sewers. This deck does not have black. The reason why you're running this is because you want an additional Surveil, and I think the Conduit Pylons actually works a little bit better than bringing in the Surveil land here that enters tapped, right? The Conduit Pylons wouldn't be another tap land. You don't really need to have the mana on turn 1, but, like, I don't know, just something to consider. Could be a Conduit Pylons. And then we've got 3 Seed Chrome Coasts and the 3 additional Darker Wastes. So the reason why the Undercity Sewers was chosen in best of 3 for a little bit because of getting the Surveil count up, and I think it's just grandfathered in from that. So Azorius Oculus has been around for a while. It's favored against mono black midrange, Esper Self-Bounce. So the reason why we don't see the mono black midrange and the Esper Self-Bounce is because of strategies like the Azorius Omniscience deck and Azorius Oculus. Like, it has a couple of bad matchups that kick it out of the top 8, or at least did this week. I imagine we'll see at some point talking about the mono black midrange and Esper Self-Bounce depending on the matchups throughout the weeks, right? It's certainly not a bad deck. It's in tier 2. You can take it to Mythic for sure. It just didn't make it to top 8 this week. So it's weak against mono red aggro, though. It struggles a little bit to slow the pace down until you can reanimate one of your abhorrent Oculuses and such. And then the opening hand, I look for Afara's Dispersal, which this one's not running. Yeah, this one's not running that. So you would want something like your Bounce Off, something to slow mono red down. And then you want enablers. So Founding the Third Path, Chart a Course if you have the Oculus or the Djinn in your hand, Picklock Prankster. Those sort of cards work really well for getting the combo going. Most of the time I'm looking for the enablers instead of like the actual recommission or the helping hand, planning to draw into those off of the Picklock Prankster and such. But anyway, you're trying to get like a turn 3 or even turn 2 Abhorrent Oculus is kind of the name of the game. All right, now for best of 3. standard challenge has gone on like nothing happened with the release of Aetherdrift. We're seeing very few cards even in the best of 3 tournament scene as well. So I'm going to kind of blitz through these. We see the Sentinel of the Nameless City was dropped from this list. It's one that you usually bring in against more aggro decks. So if you're expecting a lot of Gruul Aggro, then the Sentinel of the Nameless City was being explored because the map token is a way that you can also trigger your Valiant. We're dropping 2 copies of the Paw Patch Recruit. This does better against the single point interaction from black, worse against other aggro matchups. We're bringing in an additional Questing Druid, also worse against aggro, better against the longer matchups. We're bringing in an additional copy of the Screaming Nemesis, though, which is better against the aggro matchups. And then we're bringing out an Innkeeper's Talent, which goes more towards the mid-range. We're bringing in 3 Obliterating Bolts, which is really good against the any of the decks running Enduring Curiosity, any of the 4 toughness but sticky threats that keep coming back. It's nice to have the Obliterating Bolt. And then we have 1 copy of Torch the Tower, which largely for the same reason as for exiling sticky threats. And then we're dropping 1 Forest. So the best of 3 sideboard is dropping an Obliterating Bolt, the Pyroclasm, Torch the Tower, and the 2 Ghost Vacuums, as well as 2 Sunspine Links, which was used to hurt Esper and Domain, any of the 3-color strategies that have a lot of non-basics. The Sunspine Links is nice against those strategies. So we're bringing in 1 Questing Druid in the sideboard. You'd bring this in if you aren't up against aggro. We're bringing in an additional Paw Patch Formation. This one is really good against enchantments, creatures with flying, both with like the Unholy Annex in mono black. We're bringing in a Lithomantic Barrage, which is good against any blue or white strategies. And then we're bringing in 2 additional Paw Patch Recruits. So we can bring those Paw Patch Recruits in if we are against something that has more removal. And then we are bringing in, can bring in 2 Snakeskin Veil, which also can help us if we're needing to give something hexproof. Now remember, Nowhere to Run gets around hexproof, so you might not want to bring this in, but against black, but you would want to bring it in against like the mirror match, where you're going to have like Torch the Tower and Burst Lightning and such. All right, we got second place on February 14th was Gruul Aggro by Pedrostone. I forgot to mention earlier that was Gruul Aggro by L1X0, which stands for trash and Portuguese. Don't quote me on that. Somebody told me what it was, which is pretty awesome. But anyway, second place was also Gruul Aggro by Pedrostone. It's also dropping the 2 copies of the Sentinel of the Nameless City and bringing in 4 copies of the taking out the 4 copies of the Hired Claw, which have been kind of a staple of the mono red archetype for quite some time. So I'm curious to see why the Hired Claws have been kind of dropping out. They're probably bad against some matchup, maybe Dimir Bounce or Esper Bounce, but I'd have to look at it. We're bringing in an additional Questing Druid, again, better against the less aggro matchups. Bringing in 1 copy of the Witchstalker Frenzy, which is worse if they have a way to kind of 2-for-1 when you go to shoot your Screaming Nemesis. We're bringing in 2 copies of the Obliterating Bolt for sticky threats. Same with one Torch the Tower. And then this one's bringing in an additional Innkeeper's Talent. So again, kind of depending on how much aggro or how much mid-range you're going to be up against. I tried to post my sideboard guides that should kind of hopefully give you some guidance on this about which matchups you'd want to bring in the 4th copy of Innkeeper's Talent, which you would rather have it subbed out. And then we have an additional copy of the Burst Lightning in here, which, running 3 Torch the Towers and 3 Burst Lightnings really, I think, kind of points towards there being additional Gruul Aggro in the meta. And then, which is nice for the Witchstalker Frenzy, because then they have a harder time of 2-for-1ing you than Mono Black does. And then the best of 3 sideboard, we see that they dropped 2 Obliterating Bolts and a Torch the Tower to move them into the main. And then brought in a Pyroclasm, a Lithomantic Barrage, and a additional copy of the Sunspine Links. So this one not getting rid of that for the multicolored strategies. And then Pyroclasm is good against things like Jeskai Convoke and Boros Mice. And speaking of Jeskai Convoke, it won first place on February 15th by Ryume. And we see that they dropped the Arabella, Abandoned Doll, as well as 1 Mockingbird to bring in an additional Yoshin Frontliner, which was kind of the standard. So we lost Voldaire and Epicure. This one was kind of Sometimes it was being replaced with the Clockwork Percussionist, but this was an oldie prior to rotation. This one's always been there since Brothers War, right? Giving you an additional target for the Gleeful Demolition. That's an artifact. And we're dropping 2 copies of the Sheltered by Ghosts, since it's not pairing up well against the Nowhere to Run in Dimir Bounce and Esper Self-Bounce. We're also dropping the 2 copies of the Spring-Loaded Saw Blades and the 2 copies of the War Leader's Call. To bring in 4 copies of Torch the Tower. Again, good against the early aggro matchups and anything that has a sticky threat. And we're bringing in 3 copies of the Case of the Gateway Express. So the previous Jeskai Convoke list had dropped some of this to look at other threats like Arabella. And we're dropping 1 Plains to bring in a Darker Waste. So in the best of 3 sideboard, we've got 3 Torch the Towers are missing, being brought into the main. We're dropping 2 copies of the Protect the Negotiators. This was largely to protect from sweepers, and we're not actually seeing as many sweepers since we see a lot of Gruul Aggro and Dimir Bounce in the best of 3 meta. Might not be worth running all 4 copies of the Protect the Negotiators. We're also seeing the 3 copies of the Rest in Peace get dropped, which are really good against the Azorius Oculus and the Azorius Omniscience deck, which we see in best of 3 almost more so than we see in best of 1, although that might change. We're bringing in a 4th copy of the Destroy Evil. A lot of people like to bring this in against like Domain. Also, the Self-Bounce decks have a fair amount of enchantment loops. Spell Pierce is back, so this is a cheap way. If your opponent is anticipating a counter spell and you hit them with the Spell Pierce, you can catch them off guard until they're used to it. There's a 3rd copy of the Sheltered by Ghosts, bringing an additional copy here for against mono red. And then I like this. They're bringing in a full playset of Screaming Nemesis in the sideboard as a way to really punish mono red. If they have damage-based removal, Screaming Nemesis really switches up the play versus draw advantage, right? So like if you're on the draw, you can kind of swing this with the Screaming Nemesis by not attacking with it, by leaving it back. They have to 2-for-1 themselves to get rid of the Screaming Nemesis. All right, and we got Esper Self-Bounce by ZNT. It was 2nd on February 15th. And we're dropping the Tithing Blade. This is another one of those archetypes that does actually have some stuff from Aetherdrift just in the sideboard, if I remember correctly. So we're running a 3rd copy of the Kaido, Bane of Nightmares. Kaido's worse against aggro. Usually you're going to want to sideboard the Kaidos out. It's better in the mirror match against Esper Self-Bounce and the more controlling matchups. Because of the hexproof and being able to tap their stuff down. And same with the Defiled Crypt. Usually you're going to pull this against the aggro matchups, where better against the single point interaction of black to bring something back from the graveyard. And then we're dropping 1 island. The best of 3 sideboard, we're dropping a No More Lies, which you would bring in against the sweepers, more of the controlling matchups. We're dropping the 2 Defiled Crypts because we're bringing one of them into the main. We're dropping 2 Ghost Vacuums, leaning more on the Rest in Peace, and then we're dropping the 2 Temporary Lockdowns, relying more on the Shrouded Shepherd, and taking out the Tithing Blade as well, because we're going to be exploring some of the new artifacts like the Grim Bauble, which we got in Aetherdrift, which gives your an artifact that gives -2/-2, and then you can bounce it. And then we're also checking out the Shrouded Shepherd for the sweeper instead of Temporary Lockdown or Pest Control. Sometimes we see Pest Control in this archetype. And then we've got Momentum Breaker. And this one I think is the best one for this archetype because instead of Tithing Blade being an artifact, you get the enchantment synergies off of the Optimistic Scavenger, and it should play a lot like the Tithing Blade. It doesn't turn itself into a win condition like the Tithing Blade did, though, but it has you gain life equal to your speed. So I think I think it will be better than the Tithing Blade, but time will tell. And then we're also bringing in 3 copies of Rest in Peace, and this is going to answer your Azorius Oculus, your Azorius Omniscience decks, your Gruul Delirium decks, which sometimes we see in best of 3. Anything that has the graveyard matters, and it also protects you from like Enduring Curiosity. Doesn't, it goes away forever. Heartfire Hero doesn't hurt you because it gets exiled instead of dies. There's a couple of times where Rest in Peace is actually surprisingly good, even outside of just the pure graveyard hate. All right, and then we've got the Esper Self-Bounce by the Rat Zoo. And this was first place on February 15th because there's 2 tournaments on the Saturday. And this one is dropping the 3 Spiteful Hex Mages, Tithing Blade, and an Island to run 2 copies of Mockingbird, Overlord of the Balemerc, which we don't usually see in this archetype, but is kind of an interesting one because it has that same kind of bring things back that we're getting from the Defiled Crypt without the enchantment synergy side, though. I guess it's an enchantment creature, so it still gives it to you. And then we have 1 copy of Spell Pierce making its way into the main, and 1 copy of the Momentum Breaker. And in the best of 3 sideboard, we've got Destroy Evils down 1 copy, down 1 copy of No More Lies, down the 2 Defiled Crypts, and down 1 the Witch's Vanity. So the Witch's Vanity is one that's good against the aggro matchups, Gruul Prowess, that sort of thing, where you're eliminating your opponent's early plays and then getting the food token. It can actually be okay in the mirror match too, if I remember correctly. Again, look at the community tab for a more in-depth best of 3 sideboard guide. And then I kind of lost my spot though. What was I talking about? Oh yeah, and we also are favoring the Rest in Peace over the Ghost Vacuum, and also ditching the Tithing Blade. So this one's running Lauren of the Third Path, giving you a little bit of artifact hate, running a Spell Pierce in the main, and running a Kaido, Bane of Nightmares. You would bring this in if you aren't up against aggro. The 2 Grim Baubles, I think are probably gonna be best against the other aggro matchups, but time will tell. Shrouded Shepherd, again, gives you a sweeper for any of the go wide strategies. And then we have the 2 copies of Rest in Peace. And I personally like 2 instead of 3 just because they aren't good. They're not redundant, right? So or they are redundant. So if you play multiple copies of them, it's not beneficial. So if you have 2 of them in your hand, it's kind of a whiff, which is why I don't like to run 3. But if you really come up against a deck where this card just wins you the game, then you kind of wish you had 3, right? So there's like a give and take. All right, and we've got Gruul Aggro by Stewie15, won 2nd place on February 15th, and this one also is dropping the Sentinel of the Nameless City, so I guess everyone forgot about the Sentinel of the Nameless City at the end of Aetherdrift, or at the end of Foundations, right? This one's running 1 less Pop Hatch Recruit, running 1 more Questing Druid, 2 less Burst Lightnings, and bringing in the 1 single Witchstalker Frenzy, 1 Obliterating Bolt, and then 1 Torch the Tower, and then deciding to bring in the Snakeskin Veil to protect some of the targets. The best of 3 sideboard, we've got 1 less Witchstalker's Frenzy, the 2 Obliterating Bolts have been moved, and the Torch the Tower has been moved. For the 3rd copy of the Pop Hatch Formation, again, this is good against like Azorius Oculus, anything that has an enchantment or a flyer that you want to get rid of. It's less good for the creating a food token. That one comes up in a pinch every once in a while, but it's not something that you really go out of your way for. Sentinel of the Nameless City, though, we do see it here in the sideboard, so if you're up against other Gruul Aggro decks, this is a pretty good one for the mirror match. And then we have Pyroclasm, or an additional copy of Pyroclasm for Gruul Aggro matchups, mono red, whatever, right? Boros Prowess, Boros Mice, any of the small aggro strategies, Pyroclasm works pretty well. And then we have 1 copy of the Screaming Nemesis, which we can bring this up to 4 if we aren't up against the black interaction. And Go for the Throat is not great to see when you're running the Screaming Nemesis. And with the Witchstalker Frenzy too, you can bring in the Witchstalker Frenzy if you bring in the 4th copy of the Screaming Nemesis and lean a little bit more heavily into the Witchstalker Frenzy if you know they don't have something like Go for the Throat, which then 2-for-1s you. All right, and this is the 3rd version of Esper Self-Bounce. Did I do that right? Let's see. This should be V3. Yeah, V23, right? All right. So lots of Gruul Aggro this week, lots of Esper Bounce. This version is, if we compare it to ZNT, because we've gone through Esper Self-Bounce so much already, this one's dropping a Defiled Crypt to run the Momentum Breaker in the main. And then in the best of 3 sideboard, we have the Witch's Vanity has been cut entirely for Spell Pierce, and 1 additional copy of Sheltered by Ghosts. And so this one is good if you aren't coming up against the Nowhere to Run and you're coming up against a lot of like the Gruul Aggro strategies. And pretty good on time. We'll try to get these done in about 45 minutes each week. So the last one we're going to cover this week is Domain by Troy GG36. It was second on February 16th. And we see that if we compare this to the stuff at the end of Foundations, this one's not running Atraxa, it's not running the 2 Overlord of the Flood Pits or the Beza, and instead is bringing in an additional copy, a 4th copy of the Overlord of the Mistmoors. I think this one's the Overlord that's performed the best outside of the ramp. I like that change. We're also dropping the 3 copies of the Elspeth Smite, which helps out against the aggro matchups. And we're bringing in 2 copies of the Ride's End, which is a new card from Aetherdrift. Allows us to exile target creature or vehicle, so it can exile things that are past the 3 toughness that Elspeth Smite kind of requires them to be at. So I think the Ride's End could be a nice little fit, right? And the exile is a nice little icing on top. And this one's running pest control instead of the temporary lockdowns and the others like cheap sweepers. Being able to get rid of anything that's on that, mana value 1 or less really helps against Boros Convoke, especially. And then we're bringing in a Day of Judgment. So some lists run 1, some run 2. And then we're also running the full playset of Get Lost. I really like Get Lost, maybe a little bit too much. Being able to hit creature, enchantment, or planeswalker at the cost of giving them map tokens. But what's nice about doing the Get Lost into temporary lockdown is you can kind of remove those map tokens, and that also works with pest control. So you can kind of like get lost and then sweep if you're really worried about the value there. And then we're dropping 1 planes to bring in the Willow Rush Verge, which is the Simic Verge land that we got in Aetherdrift. So the best of 3 sideboard, we've got Pest Control has been moved to the main, we've got 2 Negates have been dropped, the 2 Terra Sunders have been dropped, and then 1 Rest in Peace has been dropped. Personally, again, I like 2 instead of 3. And then we're bringing in Elspeth Smite into the sideboard. So the main was running 3, now we only have 2 in the sideboard. Still useful against the aggro matchups where, eliminating your opponent's early pressure and then exiling something like Heartfire Hero so you don't take damage is particularly nice. We've also got the River Churn Monument. A lot of interesting stuff going on with this. Like I mentioned in MTG Joe's video, the mono blue River Churn deck. Being able to do some really cool mill strategies. I think we're going to see more and more exploration with this River Churn Monument. And I like the inclusion of this because the mirror match in Domain is really grindy. And you kind of like back in the day, you would take turns doing herd migration into Sunfalls. And in this one, you kind of do turns doing Overlord of the Mistmoors into Sunfalls, right? And so a lot of times it can go to mill, and then having something like Jace or Realmbreaker or River Churn Monument can be a way that you can kind of turn that mirror match into your favor, right? Same goes with the Doppelgang. It's for the really grindy matchups. And we're running 4 copies of the Obstinate Baloth. Since this is a combo control deck, it can struggle against a discard and hand hate. And so Baloth punishes that. If they're playing something like Hopeless Nightmare, Liliana, you can then play Baloth and be able to play the card for free when they make you discard, which definitely incentivizes them to not do that against you. And then we have Nissa Ascended Animist, which, kind of like the Terra Sunders that they pulled out, is for the enchantment hate. So like when you're up against the mirror match, being able to get rid of the enchantments is a route to go. Personally, I'm not huge on answering the enchantment strategy with Destroy Evils and such, as I mentioned in my sideboard to Esper Bounce. But that's definitely one way to go about it, is that like if you eliminate the enchantments, then Zur doesn't have a lot of really good targets. I think there's some pros and cons to that though, because like they're already getting value out of the Overlord, then you're using your spell and you're kind of falling behind if they don't go into Zur and they're just playing the Overlords. So it's kind of hit and miss. Anyway, hope I didn't confuse you too much there. If you have any questions, feel free to reach out in the comments below. That's why I do this sort of thing, is to help out people who are returning to Magic. And honestly, I just love talking about Magic the Gathering. So if you guys have anything about new archetypes that you're excited about, that I, make sure, like, have you seen this? Feel free to point things out to me that you're excited about. And I will be back on Sunday to talk about the meta breakers for hopefully some more Aetherdrift specific additions. And then next week on Monday, we'll be going through the meta review again to see what has changed as we see more. It usually takes 1 or 2 weeks for Aetherdrift to really, like a new set to really impact the meta. So hopefully we'll see that in the coming weeks. So take care, everybody. I hope you all have a wonderful one. Good luck on your RCQs and climbing the ladder. And yeah, catch you later.